Hello and welcome back to the CCENT journey with me, Ryan, and in this section we're going to pick up Telnet, SSH and banners. This is going to be part 1 because I spent quite a bit of time going into Telnet, and then we'll spend the rest of the next videos picking up SSH and banners. Now for those who don't know, you can contact me here on YouTube, on LinkedIn or Twitter. So let's jump in and have a discussion around Telnet. Now we've seen Telnet multiple times throughout the course, but we haven't really sat down, talked about what Telnet actually does and what we need to remember for Telnet for the ICND 1 exam, and we also haven't really analysed Telnet on Packet Tracer. So let's take some time out and look into it. First of all, we need to know that Telnet is TCP, so we have that reliability when we're telnetting or connecting to a remote device. It uses port 23. And it's considered insecure. And the reason it's considered insecure is because the telnet traffic is sent in plain text. So to test this, if you actually were running Wireshark on your PC and you tried telnetting to a remote location and that telnet session then established, you could actually type your username and password and then use Wireshark to pull together that TCP stream, and sure enough you'll be able to see right there in the packet capture the username and password. It can be used to test open ports. So something that I see a lot of engineers do is if we have applications, we know for example a web server, it runs port 80 for HTTP or 443 for HTTPS, and what we can do is we can use Telnet and actually specify a port. So for example, we could telnet to a remote server using port 80 rather than the default of port 23. And if the server responds and connects, then we know that the remote application is listening to that particular port. So it's a good way to test. The other thing Telnet would be good for is if you have like a firewall between you and a remote server, you could use Telnet to simulate kind of some of the traffic and to identify whether it's allowed to the remote location. This does not always work because it depends on the application, but it's certainly worth knowing that a telnet on a particular port will kind of give you a more of an understanding of what's happening when troubleshooting a particular fault. Now it's recommended to use SSH and not Telnet. So SSH is something we've not talked about in the course so far and we haven't configured, mainly because it requires more configuration than Telnet, but it's important that we know how to configure both and we know the differences between them. Now SSH is a secure protocol because it uses encryption, and ultimately before you connect to the remote device they both agree upon an encryption and you're able to connect. Now a few commands we need to remember when we think about Telnet. Now a few of these commands, as I said before, you've seen previously. So for example, you've seen me type in multiple times the VTY line, but what this actually means is 0 to 4 means that there are 5 simultaneous telnet sessions. So that means that 5 people can telnet into the box. Now you can expand this by having 0 to 15 or so forth. However, it depends on the box itself and how many open sessions it will allow to it. You can also have it where you can say the first 1 to 3 sessions uses a particular configuration and the next 4 to 10 sessions use another set of configurations. Something I've not done before, but it's something you can certainly do. We've seen the password command. This is a password against the VTY, and the VTY is the telnet element of the configuration, and login enables the login. So between the password and login, it allows you to at least connect to the device via Telnet using port 23, and using the password here we can at least log into the device and get connected. However, once we're in the device we can only have limited functionality. The reason for that is because it puts us into the user exec mode, not the privilege exec. So we can't then go EN to enable and do a bunch of commands because that's not configured on the telnet. This is why we need to also set up like an enable secret, or we can set up a local username and password, and then we can actually say instead of login we can actually type the words login local, and the local element of the login command tells it to look for a local database in order to authenticate. The last command we need to be aware of is the transport input. This tells the VTY configuration to listen to particular protocols. We have the option of all protocols, SSH, or Telnet. Now if you have Telnet configured but you're listening for SSH only, then of course it isn't going to work, and vice versa. So the transport input command is important to know. Depending on the iOS version, when you do the show run and you look at the line configuration, you'll notice that the transport input command is missing. That's because, like all other commands, when it's set to its default, it does not display in the show run. So it's important that you know about the transport input command, because they like to ask you questions around this and around VTY configuration in general. What we're going to do is we're going to jump onto Packet Tracer and we're going to configure this part of the configuration, and then we're going to investigate the output and then why we need to configure the enabled secret and or the local username and password and the difference between them. It's really important that you understand Telnet and you log on to Packet Tracer and you configure it a few times and play with the different options you have available with you, because the Telnet configuration is relatively straightforward, but it only takes one thing to be missing for it to fail. And if you're presented in the exam with a bunch of configurations and some multiple choices to pick which is missing, it's important that you're able to look at the configuration and identify which line is missing from it. So the only way you're going to be able to do that, at least without memorizing each command, is understanding what each one does and configuring it multiple times on this CLI. So let's jump into Packet Tracer and have a look at what we've just talked about. So here I am, I'm in Packet Tracer, and I'm just going to grab, let's say, a 2911, a PC. We're going to connect a cable between them. We're going to log onto the PC, and we're going to give it an IP address. And we'll log onto the router. And we'll give it the .2. And we're no shut, so the link comes up, and we'll just ensure that the PC can ping the actual router. Now this is an important step, because before we start adding upper layer protocols like Telnet, we need to make sure that our lower layer protocol, in this case layer 3, is reachable. Now it sounds like a really silly thing to do because we've only got a PC connected to a router, but it's a good habit to get into, because as your networks become more complex, people overlook the basic diagnostics and they end up essentially looking at the wrong element of the troubleshooting. So nonetheless, let's go back to the router and let's configure the Telnet. So we said we use the line VTY, and you can see we have up to sort of 15 lines on this one. We're going to use the login, and it says here enable password check-in, and of course it comes up saying the password has not been set on these particular lines, so we're going to set a password. Now it doesn't matter whether you type login and then the password, or whether you type password then the login. If you type the password first and then login, you don't see this error message, but long as they're both in there, it doesn't really matter. If we now look at the running configuration for this, you'll see, just as I said, the transport input command is not there, because again, that's a default. So what we're going to do is ultimately make sure it's set to Telnet and Telnet only. So input, because we're inputting, as in the something is connecting into the VTY line. And we're going to go Telnet. Now what we'll see is it probably show up in the running configuration. And the reason it shows up in the running configuration is because no doubt the default is probably set to all. If we set Telnet back to all, then SSH and Telnet will be able to connect, and this output of the command will not be there. But for now, we're going to actually lock it down so only Telnet configuration, only Telnet sessions can connect to these VTY lines. So now we've got the password set, we've turned on login, and we've got it to Telnet. What happens now when we Telnet from the PC to the router? So on the command prompt, Telnet. So it opens up the session on port 23 and the device comes back asking for a password. So we're going to type in the password test. And now we're in the box. But notice we're in the user exec mode. If I press EN to go into enable or user privilege mode, it says no password is set. So I can do show commands, but I can't do something like show run because show run requires the enable. But I can maybe do something like show IP interface brief. So I can see the interfaces and some other things, but I can't do any configuration. And the reason for that is because of the privilege mode by default hasn't been set against the VTY. So what I can do now is two things. Like I said, I can do the enabled secret. So the enabled secret, let's give it the word like test. And now if I disconnect, reconnect, type in the password test, now type EN. Previously we said the no password is set. Now I get the password prompt, and now I'm in the user exec mode, or the privilege exec, sorry, the privilege exec mode, and I'm able to get into the configuration and make the configurations required. Alternatively, I can know the enabled secret. So I'm back to where I was. But under the VTY, under login, I can say use a AAA method. So this is the authentication, authorization, and accounting. So for example, if I wanted it to go off and connect to a radius or TACAX, or in this case, I can use local password check-in. And now I've done that, it's going to look at the database. So here I need to go back to the global configuration mode, give myself a username, give myself a privilege level. The default privilege level I think is 1, and that's why we can't get into the enable mode. And the privilege level is 15. Password, we'll give it test. And now I have a local username and password. I still can't do this because I'm logged in with the local details of the VTY. If I now log out though and Telnet, it asks me for something a little bit different. Previously, when I done that and Telneted in, the outcome was to enter a password because I put the password against the VTY. Now it's asking for a username because it knows that I've configured the VTY to look at the local database, and that local database will have a username associated with it. So here I'm able to type Ryan and the password was test, and it's put me straight into the correct mode. If I go back, and create someone called John, but give him the privilege level of 1, and then Telnet again, John, and then the password we set John was test. Notice, because of the privilege level, I can't then go to EN because no password set. So what if I now put in the enabled secret? So there's a few different ways you can configure this, as you can see. The enabled secret is a method to go from the user exec to the privilege exec. we can overwrite the use of the enabled secret using a local username and password with the correct privilege level, or we can have the privilege level set to 1 for the username and password, and then they would have to know the enabled secret to also log into it. Okay, so last method, we're going to get rid of the enabled secret, and on the VTY line we're going to go into it, and we're going to actually put straight on the VTY line the privilege level of 15. This means that if anyone logs in, and in fact if I do this too, if anyone logs in and then uses the password of test that's assigned to the VTY line, give them privilege level 15. So now if we Telnet, we get the password again. Notice that the username options disappeared because we haven't got login local. So we know the password here is test. So let's just type in test. And then notice this, we've gone straight into the privilege exec mode because we've put the privilege level directly on the VTY line. Now you might be thinking, hang on a minute Ryan, why don't we use privilege level 2, 3, 4? Well, you can actually configure those privilege levels to be custom. So you can say, if you're privilege level 5, maybe you're allowed to do the show command, and maybe you're allowed to telnet, and that's it. If you're privilege level 6, then you're allowed to configure, but only allowed to configure the interfaces. So you could use very granular control over those privilege levels, but 9 out of 10 times, I mean, at least from my experience, no one ever really uses that. Instead, what they do is they have it at that point going to a remote server, normally like a TACAC server. So under the VTY line here, you would actually have the login, and then you would actually have the authentication to go off and authenticate through TACACs, and then that TACACs will not only authenticate you, but it will determine what you can be authorized to do, and it will actually account what you're doing. So if you've typed a particular command in a box, then it will record that so people know who made what changes and when. So really, in sort of the CCENT level, you need to know about privilege level 15 and privilege level 1, and you need to know the difference between user mode and the exec mode, and you need to know the difference between the VTY configurations. What does the transport input command does? What does login versus login local? What does the password under the VTY line actually do? What happens if you put the privilege level 15 here, or not put a privilege level 15? It defaults back to 1, and then you can use that enabled secret to get into it, or you can use the login local with a local username and password with different privilege levels. So I can't believe we spent an entire video talking about Telnet, but it's quite important to understand it because as an engineer, you'll be spending a lot of your time setting up remote access to particular boxes. So let's go through this review, and then after the review, we'll look at the Wireshark quickly before we end the video. So we said it was port 23, very important to remember this, and very important to remember it's TCP, and more important than both of those, it is insecure, and we'll see that in a moment when we bring up Wireshark. We talked about the difference between login versus login local. We said if you use the login local, you would have two options. You either use the AAA, which is outside the scope of the CCENT, or you would use the local database, and then that local database requires a local username and privilege level and password to be set in order for it to work. You can set the privilege level directly on the VTY. So if we set privilege level 15, then when someone logs in, they will instantly get privilege level 15, and then they can go into the config mode and configure whatever it is that they need to configure. It's important that you know the difference between the user exec and the privilege exec mode and the enabled secret. Make sure you go and play in Packet Tracer and play with the different variations and understand the error messages you get back. So remember I said password not set? That's a key error message, and you need to be aware of how you can sort of simulate that error message, because in the exam they may ask you, what does this particular message mean when trying to telnet to a device. So let's jump over to the lab and we'll see what we can find on Wireshark. So here we are, we're in a lab environment. This is an RDP to a test box, and this test box has a bunch of Cisco's connected to it. One of those Cisco's is responding to us on the 192.168.0.13, and I'm just going to telnet to that. As soon as I telnet to it and type in some details, actually if I get rid of the filter, you'll start to see a bunch of traffic going on here, and you can see that it's a bunch of telnet traffic to and from us. So we're .10 and the remote device is 13. If we do show IP interface brief, it will obviously send that command down. Now if we just right click on it and hit follow and go to TCP stream, you can see all of the traffic that I'm sending. So you can see that I've sent the password Cisco, and if I actually, here it's the sending and receive data, you can actually filter that again, but you get the idea. The traffic that is actually sent in this is insecure. So if I now right click on it again, follow, TCP stream, you can see everything that I'm typing in my telnet session. So if anyone between you and the destination has visibility or the ability to capture that traffic, they're able to see in plain text what it is that you're doing. I hope this video has been informative, and thank you for viewing, and if it has been, please do like and subscribe.